It's game week. We're here. We're finally here after months and months and months and months of off-season talk. Now we can talk football that's going to be played before our very eyes in Norman in just a few days. All right. Oklahoma Sooners Live for a 77th edition. Please leave your comments and questions in the live chat, and we will talk it up. Much to get to. Jason Ray's on the line, as he always is. Jason, how you doing?
Doing good, Mark. As you mentioned, we had a little bit of an appetizer last week with week 0, and now we got the full slate of games this weekend. It's exciting.
We do, and unfortunately, we're going to kick off game week show with some unfortunate news involving Wanye Morris.
Yeah, it came out today. I don't know that it's officially came out from the university yet, but Wanye Morris is suspended at least to start the season. I think based on grades and based on some other extenuating circumstances that are going on with him at a personal level. So, unfortunate. I think unfortunate for him and unfortunate for the team. All signs had pointed to him, being a guy that had really turned it around, had a different attitude, had a different work ethic about him. Coming into the spring, and certainly that carried over into the fall. But something like this is obviously very important to the staff, very important to BV, and BV's a guy that once you're in the doghouse, it's pretty difficult to get out. So again, don't know in depth in terms of how much of an impact this will be, just in terms of how long he'll be out. So I would probably anticipate Tyler Guyton getting the start in his spot at tackle. Maybe probably Jake Taylor is a guy that will probably get in the mix as a freshman, just from a backup perspective in this game. So I don't think it's a crippling blow based on some of the depth and I think the outpouring of support that Tyler Guyton has gotten from Venables and Beatonbow throughout fall camp here. But certainly, I think that obviously hurt from a depth perspective, at least early on. We'll be anxious to see how long this happens, but I think it's how long this the suspension is. But I think as of right now, that's what I would assume that they probably go with is Tyler Guyton at the right guard position, or right tackle position, I should say.
You'll all want to join Jason for post-game following the UTEP game on Saturday right here at the Voice of College Football OU. Again, Jason hosting post-game once again this year. So get here for the discussion on Oklahoma football following the first game of the season. All right, we're focused on week 1, the season 2022, but recruiting never stops, and 2 huge ones come in over the past several days. Makari Vickers, 6th rated safety in the country. We've talked him up for months here, 6'1", 180, 85th rated player in the country overall out of Florida. So a huge get at safety.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. He was a guy that it's been sort of a done deal behind the scenes for quite some time, but obviously wanted his time to certainly make that decision. And as you mentioned, I think Oklahoma probably likes him, at least right now, as a little bit more just in terms of a cornerback than a safety, but certainly has that capability to play both. So as you mentioned, another top 100 kid that Oklahoma's got. I think at the time of the commitment, I think that bumped Oklahoma to number 4. I think since then, I think they've dropped to number 5, but still top 5 class here and a lot more possibly to go. But again, it shows where Oklahoma is from a defensive recruiting perspective early on without playing any games. A guy that was really looking at potentially Oklahoma and Alabama. So another, it's a head-to-head victory on the defensive side of the ball for Oklahoma getting Makari Vickers.
Makari Vickers, high school career, 106 total tackles according to Max Preps, 15 passes defensed, 3 tackles for loss, and 5 interceptions. Makari Vickers, one of the top 100 players in the country. Wow. So tremendous commit there for the Sooners. Also coming in over the past week since our last show with everyone, Anthony Evans, the wide receiver out of Converse, Texas.
So this one was a was a true, just huge victory for Oklahoma over the last few days. So Anthony Evans is a guy that had been leaning very heavily to Oklahoma, over the last month or so. But then when everything happened with Cale Gundy, I think him more than anyone um, caused him to pause and take a step back. And as of all week, and Mark, I mean, as of Friday morning, he was set to go to Georgia. He was Venables called him almost every day over the last week. Jeff Levy, it was really kind of a full court press on the offensive side of the ball, kind of getting him back. And so to come back from that, um, and with what Oklahoma was able to do over the last week there, and really convincing that kid from that morning. I think Jay Valai was actually in on that recruitment as well late. So big, I guess you can call it a flip, flipping him from really that had the interest in Georgia and then moving over to Oklahoma. Very big. I think it was a stressful time for the kid. I heard in an interview he took a couple of days off of school because just the stress and the grind of that recruiting cycle, was really getting to him. So I think, yeah, you look at that, Mark, and huge win. And he's a 4-star, but he's not a top 100 guy. I think he's number 45 overall at his position nationally. So guy that has incredible speed, 10 to 100 is what I've heard lasered. So really, I mean, that's obviously something that you can't coach from a speed perspective. So I think he's a guy that's not typically in the mold that you look like a Jeff Levy kid, but given the fact of where he was, and Levy really being on the horn with him, I think is a big recruiting coup for Oklahoma there. And anytime you're battling head to head with schools like Georgia, I mean that's good enough for me.
All right, Jay Jones with the first comment to the show. Can we not spend more than 2 minutes on Wanye Morris? Who cares? Kids screw up. Next. Jay, I believe we timed out at 1 minute 43 seconds on Wanye Morris. You'll be pleased to know that. All right. Okay. We possibly will have a UTEP contributor coming on, Steve Helwig from SB Nation. We're waiting him. We're not going to spend a ton of time breaking down the minors, but still like to see the opponent and who you're playing on Saturday and get a little feel for who those players and schemes are to look out for. But from the Oklahoma side, Jason, regardless of final score on Saturday, let's throw out a typical 45-10 Oklahoma win. So the result, the scoreboard, is not going to be a concern unless we have another repeat from Tulane of a year ago. But most likely not going to be a concern. So what is going to be your focus? What are you most interested in seeing and would like to see from the Sooners?
I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that the staff has really preached, all spring and all summer and fall is really a lot more physicality at the line of scrimmage on both the offense and the defensive lines, which I think you've seen that so far. Does that translate over to the game? Is another thing. Adapting to the scheme on defense, I think, is going to be interesting to watch and a key for me to watch to see if there's any. It's a lot more complicated than what Oklahoma's been used to in the last few years. But just really seeing, are there any busts? Are there any guys out of position? One thing that you've seen, specifically people that have gotten an opportunity to watch some of those scrimmages here in fall camp, is the one of the big things that you notice is the improved tackling. Oklahoma tackles quite a bit more in practice than they have been in the past. So obviously, you run that danger, right, in practice if you tackle, if you're a little bit too physical around getting people hurt. But at the same time, you still want to be able to, to practice ultimately the most important thing on the defensive side of the ball, which is tackling and getting guys to the ground. So looking to see that improvement from a tackling perspective. And I think, offensively, to see how fast they go. Jeff Levy's offense obviously goes really, really fast. How do they, how do they look there from a speed perspective, and that physicality and discipline and things like that. As you mentioned, I mean, obviously there's a fair talent discrepancy between the two schools, right? So you would expect a comfortable win, but I think more than the score, you look to see, it's how some of these new and somehow these new faces, play on both sides of the ball. Obviously a lot of eyes are always going to be on the quarterback, and Dylan Gabriel will be there, but some of the newness on both offensive and defensive side of the ball, and how that works out. Venables mentioned in his press conference again that over half of this team, or at least right about half of this team, has never played a game for Oklahoma. So whether it be incoming freshmen transfers or kids within the program that really just haven't had an opportunity to play, getting some of those new faces and players in different positions maybe than they have been playing in the past, and see what that looks like. So even though it's a game that you think, and obviously you've got maybe some have a little bit of PTSD with what happened last year against Tulane, but a game that you think you have obviously a really good chance at naming the score to a certain degree. So seeing exactly what that looks like will be interesting on the field.
I will say, Jason, that I don't pour a ton of time into my season predictions. We got yours on the Big 12 last week. We did a live stream last night on the main channel with my 2022 predictions. And I got to say that there's a quick look at all the work on the various conferences, that I landed on Oklahoma in a different place than I expected to. So that could be a tease for everyone who wants to check out the link that I dropped in the chat. You might be pleasantly surprised at where I landed with Oklahoma.
Interesting.
It's not necessarily going to be in a traditional, what we've grown accustomed to, way to get to a final destination as a playoff team. But I got them there without trying. It just kind of landed that way once I did all the logistics.
Yeah, it's definitely we've talked about this many times, Mark. This is a team that has a wide variety of finishes that based on where they I think, and a lot of people are going to let their guard down on this Nebraska game, I think, but I think it's still going to be a little bit of it's going to be a tougher game than people probably realize, even specifically after this game. But still, we'll get to that when we do. But yeah, I think that'll be could be a jumping board to a pretty successful season, and then with how they performed against Northwestern, I think they'll be, at least nationally, if Oklahoma were to lose this game, or even if they struggle in a one possession win, then I think the narrative nationally might be how good this team really is.
Did all the jokes and the tongue-in-cheek comments that the two of us have made the entire offseason about Nebraska, did they not come to fruition in that game?
They absolutely did, and I don't know, Mark. You got to be if you're Nebraska, you got to be thankful that you have a. Even though it's a decent FCS opponent, right? It's a pretty good FCS opponent in North Dakota. You've got to be at least a little bit happy to see that, because some of we talked about this, Mark, about some of Scott Frost's commentary during media day was bizarre, and just his facial expressions and just his overall demeanor was a little interesting. And he his first comment after the game, he completely threw his offensive staff under the bus. And then you got a player that came out and said that, I think it was the safety that talked about this is about as bad as they could possibly play. So it's kind of scary about how good this team could be. And so just a lot of interesting comments coming off of a game that you won by 49 points last year, and you lose it in the way that they lost it. So yeah, but I mean, being with that game being in Lincoln, the kids and the crowd and everything will be super, obviously hyped for Oklahoma coming into town. So, we'll see how that goes. October 1st will be an interesting day in Lincoln, because I think October 1st is when the buyout for Frost goes down significantly. So we'll see how that goes.
They also need to feel fortunate as a football program that they have the fan base that they do, or that place would have been half empty for the last 5 years, but they continue to come and support.
Yep.
Jason, people are asking in the chat about Jaden Davis and what you expect out of him this fall, as he's trying to make a bit of a reversal on what he's shown us in the past.
Yeah, it's so that was one of my kind of key points, and probably the biggest, still to me, the biggest surprise coming out of the depth chart release. I mean, we talked about this a little bit here on this channel, that he's been running with the ones, and so probably not a complete surprise to see him listed as the starting cornerback, early on, and in that initial depth chart. And there was even a question to Venables in his press conference, which he took a little bit of an exception to, about the surprise of him being listed as the first team cornerback. And but yeah, I mean, I think it's a surprise to all of us. As I mentioned, he was probably would have been my fourth or fifth, and not really choice, but fourth or fifth thought of who would be the starting cornerback for Oklahoma. I figured DJ Graham would be one opposite Woody Washington, or maybe even Josh Eaton, or maybe even CJ Colden coming over from Wyoming. But no, but everything's earned with Brent Venables. So I think it'll be one of the key things to watch. UTEP has a couple of pretty decent wide receivers, so it'll be interesting to watch and see, what that looks like, because I think he'll be challenged a little bit. But all signs point to him having a completely rejuvenated season, or at least preseason here. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, but if he starts to struggle, starts to not tackle well, and gets lost in coverage from time to time, then we'll see how tight of a string he has.
Yeah, we'll keep the Casey Thompson comments brief. Obviously, we stick to Oklahoma here, but he is an opposing quarterback coming up in a couple weeks. He looked like Aaron Rodgers for the first half, and then he just lost his rhythm and a bit of confidence, and they started to bring some heat. And he had a clean pocket for his first 15 throws of the game. He was throwing 7-on-7 drills. There wasn't a hand in his face, nothing, and he delivered the ball beautifully. Then they started to get a little pressure, and I was impressed, because the first handful of throws in which he got pressure, he was still delivering the ball on time and on the money. But then I think things just started to go south, and he's not an NFL quarterback as of yet. And so the law of averages caught up with him, that he wasn't going to stay that hot for that long. And the rest of the game started to deteriorate around him, and maybe that affected his play as well. But certainly Oklahoma is going to run into a capable quarterback. That's probably one of the 10 or 20 best in the country. He's not at the very top by any stretch, but he's really good. And he's not going to threaten the defense running the ball. He's mobile enough, but that's what Oklahoma is going to see in a few weeks.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think as you'd mentioned, and keeping the comments brief, one of the things he struggled with last year at Texas, when he had pressure in his face, his accuracy and things like that would fall a little bit. And yeah, he can run, but he's not the most mobile quarterback in the country. So I think if teams are able to get in his face and generate some pressure, I think you have the capability. But I think, they were firmly in control of that game, 28-17, and then the inexplicable onside kick call obviously completely changed the game. But Yeah, I mean the offensive line didn't protect as well as in the second half as they did in the first half. So yeah, I think he's one of those guys, and most quarterbacks are the same, but I think he's one of those guys that really is reliant on a good clean pocket.
All right, folks, bring your comments and questions here to Oklahoma Sooners Live. We're here every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time, and of course, we've got the UTEP Miners as the opponent for the Sooners here in Week 1. What time is kickoff, Jason?
2:30 p.m.
2:30 Central. So we would guess at whatever point, a few minutes after the game, you're going to join Jason right here on the OU channel for postgame.
Absolutely.
All right. We got Steve Helwig coming on the line from SB Nation, Underdog Dynasty, and also Hustle Belt to break down some UTEP football for us. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing excellent, and it's fun on week 1 to already have to break down a team that's played a game where you have some sample data points on them.
Yeah, so what did we find out about the Miners on Saturday?
There was a lot of concerning things in that game in the second half. The offense could not move at all. Going into the game, UTEP, well, this was kind of a lot of their offensive scheme last year was UTEP just throws a ton of deep balls. And you can see that with Gavin Hardison finishing 21 for 48 in his game. And early on in that game, the deep shots were working, and UTEP had a 7-0 lead, then a 10-7 lead on North Texas. But then North Texas's defense adjusted, and so many of those balls were hitting the turf later on, and UTEP's offense just struggled from there on out. It looks like they found a new number 1 wide receiving threat in Tyron Smith, who had 7 receptions for 127 yards in the opener. And that'll be big because they lost their top 2 receivers last year, including Jacob Cowing, who transferred to Arizona after having 1,300 yards receiving and being one of the top wideouts in the country. So they really needed to replace that threat. And then on the defensive side of the ball, UTEP just seemed average at best in both areas. Their offense wasn't really doing them any favors. They got shut out in the second half. Then defensive side of the ball, North Texas's rushing game did a decent job of getting around them, as did Austin Aune in the passing game. He had 3 touchdowns on a decent day of 236 yards. So I do think that UTEP's defense, they expected to be a little better up front. Then they got 0 sacks in that game, and this is a defensive line with Praise Amahule and Jadrian Taylor, 2 sack artists from last year. So the fact that they weren't able to penetrate North Texas's offensive line was some early signs of concern for the pass rush.
Is there any way possible that UTEP, I'm not even going to go to the nth degree of winning the game, but in regards to any kind of matchups, you spotlighted a few standouts on both sides of the ball, could take advantage of Oklahoma in any such way?
I would say these deep balls that I was talking about earlier, where Gavin Hardison just launches it down deep, which he's not afraid to do 25, 30 times a game when out of his 50 attempts that he's getting, because they're going to pass the ball a lot. So Oklahoma's replacing a ton on defense. I think they lose 3 of their 4 leading tacklers from last year. Delaren Turner-Yell, a talented safety, played kind of a center field role down there. So I think that UTEP should try these high risk deep balls that didn't work well against North Texas and see if that is their best way. But I really don't think UTEP has much of a chance in this game after the data point that we received on Saturday against North Texas. North Texas looked better than them in every facet of the game, and North Texas's defense was just strong enough to prevent UTEP from really getting anything after the first minutes of the second quarter.
Steve, what's your read on Oklahoma this year? It seems to be a 3-team race for the Big 12 championship. Maybe Texas jumps in as well. Kansas State's kind of an outside wild card that a lot of people like. But between Baylor, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, where do you think the Sooners land?
I actually predicted Oklahoma to win the Big 12 this year. I really like what they have in Dylan Gabriel, who I thought was an outstanding quarterback at UCF. I don't think any quarterback in the country places his deep balls better than Dylan Gabriel. And I know Oklahoma has a lot to replace in the receiving core. They're losing Mario Williams and Jaden Hazelwood. They still return Marvin Mims, who is an excellent receiver and is going to be a 1,200-yard wideout this year. But Dylan Gabriel at UCF, just every time they'd have to replace receivers, he would make stars out of the next ones. When 2019, when he was a true freshman, that was the year that they made a star out of Gabriel Davis, who's now thriving with the Buffalo Bills. And then the next year, Marlon Williams was one of the leading receivers in the country. So it just seems like UCF was just replacing number one receivers under Dylan Gabriel with ease. And I think Oklahoma should be able to do the same, just the way the communication he has with his receiver. And then just he's an excellent quarterback overall, and he's really improved his mobility lately. So I'm really high on Dylan Gabriel, especially. I think Eric Gray, after what we saw in the Alamo Bowl last year, can be a pretty strong rushing threat for this team. So just like all the Lincoln Riley offenses, I really think Oklahoma's offense is going to be one of the superior ones in the country this year. And defensively, you have a defensive mastermind in Brent Venables taking over that defense. I like the transfer addition of Jeffrey Johnson from Tulane clogging the middle, which should really help Reggie Grimes and Ethan Downs formulate a pass rush, because Oklahoma lost Nick Benito last year. They lost Isaiah Thomas, which were really their two premier pass rushers. So I think that they can restock and reload pretty well defensively too. And I think this is a good all-around team that you're going to see double-digit wins.
Jason, anything for Steve before we let him go?
Well, I mean, I watched most of the UTEP North Texas game, and you know, if you just look at the box score, it's very, very interesting, right? You lose a game, if you're UTEP, you lose a game by 18, but yet you are even in yardage, you're even in the turnover battle. So it looks like a very even game from that perspective. But I think, Steve, to your point, Hardison has an outstanding arm, but you know, they went to the deep ball, and it wasn't quite as successful in the second half there. So yeah, I mean, not coming into this season, coming off the bowl season last year, I know that you'd mentioned that this was a team that I believe did not beat a team with a winning record last year. However, still made a bowl game last year. So I expected. I actually picked UTEP to win this game. I thought they probably would win. Thought it would be an even game, but with a home field advantage, I thought that would bring UTEP. But I think, to your point, you're spot on. I think the area that they'll probably look to at least attempt to exploit Oklahoma is in the secondary through the passing game, and more specifically through that deep ball. But I thought they would have a little bit more success running the ball against the North Texas team that I think was replacing a lot on their front four defensively. But yeah, it was really an interesting game. Just looking at the box score, you want to say, how did they lose this game by 18? Everything was even from a statistical perspective.
All right, Steve, anything else before we let you go?
I don't think so. I think this should be a pretty one-sided affair. It's not like Oklahoma-Tulane last year, where Oklahoma had to worry late down the stretch after Tulane got that onside kick, which I called Tulane maybe one of the best 2-10 teams I've ever seen last year. But I don't think UTEP's going to be able to challenge Oklahoma in this game. If I want to have a comparable game on UTEP's schedule last year, I would say it was that Friday night game early on in the season when they played Boise State. And Boise State was just generating touchdowns after touchdowns early. I think they had 3 touchdowns in a 3-minute span. And I think that Oklahoma takes care of UTEP early. UTEP's still very improved under Dana Dimmel, but this will not be their game.
Steve Helbeck, check out his work on Underdog Dynasty and Hustle Belt at SB Nation. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by, and if you have time, we'll have you on tap for the Michigan show a little bit later today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Steve. All right. That's the UTEP side. I did not catch any of that game and just see that, they chucked it about 50 times against North Texas and couldn't keep up. But, statistically, turnovers seems to be, if you see the yardage is the same, then the turnovers usually are the indication of why there's a 3-touchdown spread, but that was not the case either. So.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I watched a decent amount of the first half, but didn't catch didn't catch most of the second half, which was, you know, obviously the where the game turned a little bit. But yeah, I mean, when you look at specifically his arm strength, I think that, you know, off the tape, you know, maybe looks like one of those things that maybe could present a little bit of problems in the deep ball. But I think Oklahoma will have a decided advantage at the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. So we'll see. And I think they probably have motivation. Most of these kids weren't, I mean, at least half the kids weren't around last year, but still, I think that was probably instilled, you know, in these kids' head leading up into this game, how they, you know, almost lost to Tulane in this type of situation. Specifically, the situation where the point spread was pretty comparable to what it was last year against Tulane. So I think they'll have a little bit more focus and be a little bit more ready throughout the entire game as opposed to what happened last year.
Jason, are you good if we go through the 3 skill position units on offense: quarterback, running back, wide receiver / tight end, and get your estimation on where those numbers are going to finish?
Sure, yeah.
With Dillon Gabriel in particular, he stays healthy, completes the season. You know, where do you think he's going to land in regards to completion percentage, yardage, TD versus pick ratio?
Yeah, that's interesting, Mark. I mean, when you look at, I mean, I think when you look at UCF teams, when you look at Baylor teams, and even when you look at Ole Miss teams, you think these are, I mean, I think immediately what comes off the cuff is that this is a team that these are teams that throw the ball around a lot, which, you know, just isn't necessarily the case. But I think Dillon Gabriel has a very good chance to have a 3,500 yard season. I think, you know, if he stays healthy, I think 30 plus touchdowns is very much, very much an opportunity for him. You know, if he has a really good season, potentially could get into the high 30s, low 40s. But I think, you know, somewhere, you know, I would say somewhere around 32 touchdowns, 7 or 8 interceptions is kind of my thought. I think the one thing that you look at, which I think he's made tons of improvement in, you know, being injured last year and then what he's been doing overall, just in terms of a completion percentage. I think he's a career right around 60%, 59, 60% completion percentage. I think if he can get that up to in the mid 60s or even approach the high 60s, I think he has an opportunity to obviously, you know, be even more successful than he has been in the past. So, you know, you've got the support system around him, you know, in terms of talent at the skill position, and then the hopefully the offensive line that's a little bit better than what he's accustomed to at you know, in his career at UCF. So I think if he can stay healthy, he has an excellent opportunity to have a great season.
Jason, we talked last week that I'm interested to see how the running backs are going to be used, not just in regards to carry distribution, but how they're used. And, you know, the one thing that is not readily available in regards to the coach's evaluation going into the first game is who's going to be a liability versus a benefit in pass protection. And then obviously, you know, we can readily see running and catching, but that's certainly a component that is going to factor in as well. So going through the 3 to 4 running backs that you believe are going to play, you know, how do you think that distribution plays out throughout the season and then converts to stats?
Yeah, so if you look at the depth chart, if you take that into consideration, you know, you've got your first 2 running backs are pretty clear: Eric Gray and Marcus Major, and then you've got Tawi Walker and Javonte Barnes listed as the 3rd and 4th backs. So I mean, I think you've got good balance that you'll have in place between those 4, and I think you, in terms of yardage, it's really kind of tough to define. I think when you look at Eric Gray, I think combined total yards is going to be big for him. You know, I could see him in the neighborhood of 700-800 yards rushing, and then somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 to 400 yards receiving. I think he's going to. He did have 23 catches last year. I think you could see him upwards of 35 to 40 catches out of the backfield this year, because I know they really want to get him out in space as much as they possibly can. But I think you've got a lot of these kids that are going to play very specific roles. I think Tyree Walker's a guy that's probably a short yardage goal line back. More so, you think in the mold of a Trey Sermon, who really was a guy that really was used a lot in fourth quarters of games to, big, strong kid that was really, really tough to tackle. And so I could, lay into some of the defenses that were a little bit, more fatigued. I wouldn't be surprised to see, honestly, to see Marcus Major lead this team in rushing. He's more of a kind of between the tackles, prototypical running back. So I could see Marcus Major somewhere in the 900 to maybe even 1,000-yard range. And Mark, I think the big wild card in this whole thing is Javonte Barnes. I think he has the talent and he has the ability to possibly be the best pure running back on this team. But to your point that you made before, he is a true freshman. How does he pass protect? How does he do the little things that Levy's going to ask him to do? And so that's the one thing that's a little bit of a unknown. I think you could see him be a guy that mid-year be a guy that maybe even gets more carries than Eric Gray. Out of the backfield. But I would, as we talked about with the way that Levy runs this offense, I could see, a situation where Eric Gray gets about 12 to 15 carries a game, very similar to Marcus Major. And then you've got maybe 10 to 15 carries that you split between Javonte Barnes and Tawee Walker, depending on how things go. I think you've got a unit here, Mark, that will be, kind of one of those things, which happens a lot, where you see whoever has the hot hand gets more carries. So I think you've got an upward trajectory for Javonte Barnes that maybe is a little bit higher than some of the other ones. But I think just seeing how he reacts to his first major college football game and through the early part of the season as well will be dependent on how much he can really help this team from a carry perspective.
So as we heard, Steve is high on Marvin Mims, who caught 30 or 35 passes. I think 35 was the number last year. Could certainly be utilized a lot more. Yeah. Your thoughts about wide receiver distribution?
Yeah, no, I think as a group, this group is much better than they were a year ago. I think you've got on paper, I should preface that by saying on paper, you've got a lot of kids that really haven't made a huge contribution to this team. So Marvin Mims is obviously the most explosive, the most has the most experience on this wide receiver core. So you got a guy like him. I would be shocked if he's not 1,000-yard receiver this year. Just the amount of times that they're going to try to get the ball in his hands. I think he'll be a volume receiver. He's listed as a slot guy. They'll probably move him around, kind of depending on how the defense is covering him, so to speak. And so then you've got some other ones. You've got Theo Weiss right there. He's had an excellent summer, excellent fall camp. He's listed as one of the starters at the wide receiver position as well. I think he's a guy that you could probably, if he's anywhere near his 2020 form, he's a guy that you could see 700-800 yards receiving this year. 6 or 7 touchdowns. Then you got Jalil Farooq, who completely has been a game changer in fall camp and in scrimmages. And so he's kind of my dark horse from a stat perspective, Mark. I think he's a guy that you could make an argument. I think he's more physically imposing as a wide receiver out there than a Marvin Mims. So you could make an argument where he could potentially be the leading receiver this year if there's much more attention placed on Marvin Mims, with Farooq being more of a a relative unknown, at least nationally at this point, right? But then you've got a lot of guys at a supporting cast perspective. You've got you've got a couple of the transfers in LV Bunkley Shelton. You've got JJ Hester. You've got a couple of freshmen, and Jaden Gibson and Nick Anderson to see how they. Then you've got the reliable Drake Stoops that's been out there. So you've got a lot of depth there that maybe not necessarily that Oklahoma has had in the past, and what appears to be quality depth. Now, obviously, a bit of an unknown with the transfers coming in, and then the true freshmen, what level of play that they get. I think Jaden Gibson is a guy that you can see maybe 500-600 yards receiving, but I think his growth and his where he can help this team the most will probably be in the end zone, red zone type situations. Could certainly see him being a big red zone target, 7 or 8 touchdown receptions this year for potentially Jaden Gibson. And I think Gibson's wide receiver is an area where you can see getting on the field maybe a little bit sooner than some other positions as well.
Sooners Live, folks, every Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time. Get on back here next week. Bring a friend or 2 or 50. And let's blow up the show here during the 2022 season. And, of course, join Jason after the ball game. I sometimes lead into that and try to estimate what time that's going to be. But it's pretty simple. When the game's over, Jason's going to be on. So there you go. Taking your comments and questions right here.
That's right. Certainly
Jason can do whatever he wants. That's his deal. But I certainly give my blessing, not that you need it, Jason, but if it's, 52-3 halfway through the fourth quarter, to rev it up early, do whatever you want. But there you go. Don't have to wait till the final second of that type of game. But seeing some comments in the chat. I've been looking around trying to verify some rumblings here that the Sooners and Longhorns will leave early for the SEC, and that certainly would be no surprise to either one of us. We've talked about it for months and months and months that we anticipate this not, this deal was announced in the summer of 21, and to expect these leagues not to move until 2025. The SEC is forward thinking. They want 2 more big brands in the league. Let's get on with the future and not be waiting and waiting and waiting from a media rights standpoint, from a scheduling standpoint, and how we're going to divide the league and form the league in terms of divisions and pods. It just makes no sense that it's not going to happen sooner than 2025, and people are letting us know that that's out there today.
Yeah, so I think this started, Mark, this morning with, I think it was Pete Thamel that reported that ESPN and others that were starting to get into negotiations with the Big 12 media rights deal. And I take this with a little bit of grain of salt because I haven't seen specifically anyone else report this, but Dennis Dodd has reported that he has learned that while that's ongoing, Oklahoma and Texas are actively negotiating to leave the Big 12 conference early. So would like to have that, just from a credibility perspective, would like to see that echoed by maybe some other ones, and maybe it's out there, but I just haven't seen it. But I think, number one, that's really good for the Big 12, right? I think one of the big things is, they're trying to lure some of those other Pac-12 teams over there. And so I think this is a really brilliant move for the Big 12 to really kind of put that revenue in place to see, okay, this is what this would look like in terms of their slice of the pie for some of these teams, like I think Colorado, Utah, some other Oregon's maybe potentially. I think Oregon's really wanting to move to the Big Ten, but just to see how that looks. And so as we talked about, I was probably, Mark, I was fairly in the 2024 circle, but when when everything with USC and UCLA happened, knowing that they're moving to the Big Ten and they'll start that, and then the TV start that next year, then the TV revenue, situation that the Big Ten signed. I think that happening next year has sort of forced both, more so probably on the SEC side, but Oklahoma and Texas to move forward in a little bit of a quicker fashion. So I think all signs seem to be pointing and indicating that Oklahoma, Texas will be in the SEC next year. We'll see how that continues to progress. Obviously here through the next few. I mean, who knows with these things? When these things happen, it seems like they move extra quick. Right. I mean, when we first heard about the UCLA USC thing, it was announced either later that day or the next day by both schools. So some of these things start happening pretty quickly. So once they get leaked, at least. So I think it's exciting. I think a lot of people would like to see Oklahoma and Texas move over next year, but we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I'm firmly in the camp that I think it'll happen next year. Now I don't see I see the SEC waiting around and allowing what USC and UCLA are doing in the Big Ten just overall, with now being the richest conference in the country, surpassing the SEC. They're not going to. I don't think that they're going to stand and be in a holding pattern on that.
And it looks like I'm not going to get my wish of having Oklahoma and Texas stay in the Big 12 and play Cincinnati, UCF, Houston, and BYU. I wanted to see them all smashed together for an uncomfortable year and then see the results play out to favor one situation or the other. But it'll probably be a clean break.
Yeah, I think so. I think it will be too. I mean, I'm with you. I would be interested in it, at least for a year, just seeing what that looks like. But I think the idea of Oklahoma and Texas being at 11 a.m. on CBS, things like that, really intrigue. Obviously the SEC, but for another year. But then, because I think they'll still broadcast SEC games next year. Then 2024 is when that contract is completely over. So, I mean, that's something that they would, that they would love, CBS would love. And so, I mean, I think it would be nice as you mentioned, just to see what that, Big 12 looked like for a year. But I think, you're right. I don't think either one of us will get that wish.
Yeah. CBS is going to have to juggle, if I've got this straight, the Big Ten and the SEC next season. The contracts are going to overlap, so that'll be interesting to see how you got to think that they're going to favor their new partner over their old partner that's outgoing, but at the same time, SEC games are attractive, so they'll have to figure out what that means to them. And again, I wanted to see some interesting matchups that we're not going to see otherwise, at least take place for a year. But probably a clean break with Oklahoma, Texas leaving at the same point that the other four jump into the Big 12. And the Big 12 then, looks to the West Coast to see what they can do to further stabilize and build the league into something that can somewhat challenge the Big Ten and the SEC, not at the same level, but at least maintain their relevancy in the sport. All right, Jason, we appreciate you doing this. As always, we've gone 77 consecutive weeks. So everyone, appreciate what Jason brings every week to our show here every Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time. We will have a game in the books this time next week to review and look forward to week 2. So come on back and bring a few folks with you here at Oklahoma Sooners Live here on the OU channel. And of course, join Jason after the game for post game. And we'll see you then.
All right. Thanks, guys.